All right. Well, we have certainly um, done some things already in some of our meetings about the history behind Jesus. So this isn't like we've never talked about it. It isn't like we've never talked about it. But it's funny that today it's very interesting. It seems like it's becoming more common. Like you can open up the Bible with college students more than you used to, and they don't grill you like with 55 objections about the New Testament. At least conversationally speaking. I know there's a lot of stuff online, but I'm just saying it's good that they're open to just hear you read a passage from the New Testament. But it isn't that way everywhere, obviously. But Jesus, no doubt, is one of the probably the most researched person in the history of mankind. I remember reading Lee Strobel's book, The Case for the Real Jesus, back a long time ago. This book came out a long time ago. And I remember him saying in the introduction that when you do a search for Jesus at Amazon, you find 175,986 books. Well, there's more than that now because this book came out like 15 years ago or something. So there's been a lot more written since then. And there's no shortage of books about Jesus. But Jesus, of course, has been on every magazine cover there ever has been. And of course, people try to make him look like something. I remember every time Time Magazine came out with a cover with an article about it, my dad used to get Time Magazine and then they used to hand it to me, like, oh, have you read this? Time Magazine says this and this and this. And I was like, well, Mom, I don't really get my information about Jesus from Time Magazine, but I'll read it. But anyway, um, if you want to get I'll just give you a few of my recommended readings on the topic. This is still one of my favorite books on the topic. It came out in about 2008 or 9. I think 2008 or 9, but this was one of my favorite books that talked a lot about historical evidence behind Jesus, and it's still a good book, but that's one of my favorite books, addresses some of the skeptical objections. And the Brant Pitre book is really good. That came out, I think, about 8 or 9 years ago. That's a really good book. I thought that was one of the better ones. John Dixon's little book called Is Jesus History is a good book. And this book I did a whole Zoom call on. I don't know if you guys remember, I did it about 3 months ago. 3 or 4 months ago, I did a call. I kind of summarized my friend Ben Shaw's book, 13 Arguments, Reliability of the New Testament. I know Ben, he's a friend of mine, he's a young guy, but he wrote this book last year, and I reviewed it on Amazon too. But it's a good little book. I think it's really the perfect length. And it's got really good, concise arguments for the reliability of the New Testament. So that would be one of the most current books that has come out over the last few years. But I would recommend that book too. Okay, so when we say, did the New Testament authors tell the truth? Obviously, I think that most people sitting in the pews in churches every Sunday, when they hear their pastor open the Bible and preach on something from the New Testament, or for that matter, the Bible in general, they assume that the biblical authors told the truth. I mean, they don't think they're making stuff up or fabricating things or deliberately lying or anything. And we know that when we think about people why they lie about something, there's generally motives. There has to be motives. Everybody has a motive for why they lie about something. Generally, the three main motives are for financial gain or sexual gain or power. At least those are three of the most common motives behind why people lie. So if the New Testament authors did not tell the truth about Jesus, you'd have to ask, do we see any evidence that they got any of these things? Did they receive a large payout? Did they get any sexual gain, or did they get power? We know that Jesus and his early followers, especially his early followers, was a persecuted movement. They were not accepted by the majority of the Jewish community. They were not accepted certainly by the Roman authorities. And we know that there was the persecution started in the book of Acts. We know that Stephen was the first martyr. We know that they were on foot a lot, going from town to town or different places doing their missionary work. We know Paul was constantly traveling. There's not a lot of evidence that we see that they gained any big financial payout as far as we can see. And there's definitely no evidence they got any sexual gain. As you know, the New Testament has um, a lot of strong exhortations about sexual purity and other things. And we know that it doesn't look like they got a lot of power. The faith, our faith wasn't birthed, in some giant institution in the first century. Yes, it became more institutionalized many centuries later after it split apart from its Jewish roots or broke away from its Jewish origins. But at the beginning, it was certainly not a movement that was gaining a lot of power and a lot of influence. I mean, it's gaining influence to the extent people were coming to faith and getting saved, but not like an institutional power or anything as an institutional power. So none of those things are there as far as motives. So there's no reason, to think that the New Testament authors are being dishonest. Now, we know that in the time of Jesus, we know that we don't have access to things like video cameras and internet and texting and phone and television. Sorry, I have it numbered as 4 ones. I just felt like doing that. But the point is that we don't live in the way it is today. We don't have those kinds of resources in our hands. So none of us were there to see Jesus visually. None of us were there to participate in the events of the New Testament, just like everything in the past. It's in the past. We weren't there to see a lot of things in history or in antiquity, right? We weren't there to see a lot of things in science. We weren't there to see the beginning of the universe. We weren't there to see how life got going. We weren't there to see the initial conditions on planet Earth, how they all came together. We weren't there to see how your DNA came together or how first life came together. We weren't there to see any of those things. Okay. So what we do with history is just like any history is done. Any historian will always try to figure out what happened or reconstruct what happened and try to come up with the best explanation, depending on how many written documents they have and whether they're primary or secondary sources. I'll define those as we go on here. They'll ask, do we have any witnesses that witnessed the event? They've written it down. Can we trust the witnesses? Are they telling the truth? Do they have written testimony or oral testimony? Obviously, we don't have oral testimony with the New Testament because all the witnesses are dead now, and they wrote everything down that they wanted us to have. Sometimes they'll look for any archaeology or what we call external data that backs up what was written down. They want to see, some of the things these people wrote about corroborated by archaeology. Are the things that really help us know that these authors are writing about historical people and historical places, right? I mean, some of us have been to Israel. We know that when you walk through Israel, you see specific places that are written about in the New Testament. So we know that the New Testament authors are not writing Harry Potter fiction novels or Lord of the Rings, right? And then historians also ask, what's the best explanation for, how the Jesus movement, or how did Jesus and his followers, how did this new religious movement get going? Like, what are the historical factors surrounding that? They want to know what is the cause of that new movement to get some momentum and keep going. Of course, we think the resurrection was what kept the movement going, and obviously has kept it going to this day. If Jesus had died and there'd be no resurrection, it probably would have died out right away. Now, obviously, when it comes to Jesus and the New Testament, you are dealing with supernatural events, supernatural realities and miracles, things that, many people would say some of those things just, we don't see people walking on water today and rising from the dead. We don't see virgin births and people feeding, Jesus, some of the miracles Jesus did. Some people say, these are supernatural realities and miraculous events. So sometimes it doesn't matter how much history you give them, they can't get over the philosophical issue of miracles. Okay. And so that's more of a philosophical issue. That's a worldview issue. That's the way they view reality, that they don't think that our world is a place where miracles happen or supernatural realities exist. Well, if that's the case, then it's not going to matter how much historical evidence you give them. They have a worldview bias problem, that they're against supernatural realities. Now, most people, I think more people than not believe in supernatural realities. To say everybody is skeptical of supernatural realities is nonsense. Statistically, many people do believe in miracles, think they happen today. Many people are into the paranormal, they're into New Age, they're into supernatural things. Whether they're the right supernatural things is a debated issue, right? But many people, I'd say more people than not all people, but more people than not believe there's more than just the natural world. Okay. So if you run into people that have problems with the miracles in the New Testament about Jesus, sometimes they might say, well, I like the teachings of Jesus, but I don't like I don't believe in the miracles. They don't like this. They don't believe in the supernatural Jesus, like I've said before, because the supernatural Jesus makes a claim on their life. So it's a lot easier just to believe in the ethics of Jesus, right? That Jesus is a great ethical teacher. People like the Sermon on the Mount, and they like his commands, love your neighbor. So, that's about as far as they go with Jesus. Or else they say, like, well, the miracles are just symbolic. They didn't really happen. They just give us hope, meaning and hope. Like the resurrection didn't necessarily have to happen. It's just we get hope and meaning from it. It helps us cope with reality, right? But it didn't really factually happen. Similar to what some Jews say about the Exodus, liberal Jews, that is. So some people are like that. You run into some people like that. I've had that happen. It just depends on who you're talking to. So the way I see it, um, I'm really into acronyms, believe it or not. I haven't given a lot of acronyms in my calls, but I figured this is an easy one to memorize, which is power. So I think that these 5 letters are kind of easy to remember when you're thinking about what we can know about Jesus and whether the New Testament authors told the truth. So I kind of like this, but you do what you want with it. But I kind of broken this down in an acronym. So when it comes to knowing anything about Jesus, there's no doubt that any historian wants the earliest records, the earliest evidence is the best evidence. And even in a book that was written a long time ago, which I still have, called Historian's Fallacies by David Hackett Fischer, he said the best evidence is the evidence it's close to the event itself. Obviously, that makes sense because the further you get away from an event, the more likely it's going to be legendary or you're going to run into embellishments. If you ever run into people that say, well, what about the Gospels that are not in the New Testament? Like, what about the Gnostic Gospels or the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Judas, or the Gospel of Thomas? All those, we call those Gnostic Gospels. Those are Gospels that are written well after the first century. They're much later than the canonical Gospels, and they have a lot of embellishment in them. You can read them and just tell because they've gotten so much further away from the event, from the actual time of Jesus. You can tell that things in them are embellished. And that's why people that say sometimes, well, there's other books that weren't in the New Testament, and they're trying to hide those, and it's about power. They want to keep those out of the church's hands, and Christians, they don't want Christians reading those. And I'm like, no, that's not true at all. You can read those books anytime you want. Most of them are available online, or you can buy the Gnostic Gospels in a whole set and read them, sit down and read them all you want. Nobody's hiding anything. But the reason they're rejected and they're not accepted as part of the canon is because the New Testament canon is because they're dated too late. One of the reasons they're just dated way too late, and you can tell if you have something that's written 160 AD compared to the 4 Gospels written before the first century. Obviously, you're going to go with the earlier records. So that's just common sense. Now, I said before that Paul is the uh, earliest records we have. Um, his records come before 65 AD, around 40 to 65 AD, 45 to 65 range. He doesn't write biographies about Jesus, but his letters are 13 books of the New Testament are written by Paul. And he does include information there about Jesus. So Paul is our earliest sources for knowing anything about Jesus. Like I said, they're not biographies, but they certainly have information about Jesus in them. So those are earliest sources for Jesus. And I said before that historians generally they look for primary and secondary sources. Now, if you've never heard of these terms, a primary source is what we call the testimony of an eyewitness. Somebody that was a contemporary of the events they talk about. They had to be living at that time. A secondary source is somebody who's not a direct eyewitness, but they get the information from the other eyewitnesses. They can be alive at that time, but they get the information from the direct eyewitnesses. Okay, so Paul would be a little bit of both, because technically he wasn't one of the original disciples, right? He wasn't the original 12. So he would be in a way a secondary source because he is getting some of the information from the other eyewitnesses, but he's also a primary source because in a way, he'd had that special encounter with Jesus on the Damascus Road, so he was an eyewitness to the resurrection. But we know that he definitely was. He was spending time with the other apostles. He was with Peter in Galatia. He was with James. He probably got information from them about Jesus as well. We can't say 100% for sure, but he definitely spent time with the apostles, the other apostles. So anyway, he'd be a little bit of both, probably. Now, most scholars, if you take like at Ohio State where I do ministry, if you take a New Testament class there, which I don't take, but I have students in our group who've taken a New Testament class at Ohio State, which is a secular school, so they're going to hear secular arguments. But they always read a textbook by Bart Ehrman on the New Testament. That's their textbook they use. And Bart Ehrman is an atheist New Testament scholar who teaches down at Chapel Hill, North Carolina. He believes Jesus was a real person. He believes that Jesus was considered a miracle worker, and he believes Jesus was crucified. He believes the disciples think they saw Jesus rise from the dead, but he just doesn't think the resurrection happened because he doesn't think history can tell us whether miracles happen. So that's what we call methodological issue, and that's a philosophical issue. But he says that we have what's called the undisputed letters of Paul, that most scholars accept at least 7 letters for sure written by Paul himself. Now, the ones they don't accept, I don't have time to go into every detail. Mostly it's only because they say Paul's theology sounds different over here, and one letter over here doesn't sound like Paul's saying something quite the same way, or his writing sounds a little different. I think the arguments are stupid. I think Paul wrote all 13 letters, and I think there's good reasons to believe that. So I'm not convinced by any of the arguments that Paul only wrote 7 of the 13. I'm just saying, if you get within New Testament scholarship, you might hear that. But anyway, even if he did write 7 of the 13, he used we know Paul used secretaries. He says so in his letters. But even if he did only write 7 of the 13, there's a lot of information in there about Jesus. I think all 13 letters are written by Paul. I can send you some information by email if you're interested. I don't have time, but anyway. So Paul's letters are written, like I said, between about 47 to 60, 65 AD. We know that the temple was destroyed in 70 AD. We know all the first century writings of the New Testament were dated prior to the first century, by the end of the first century, because John's doing the latest gospel. But Paul's letters are the earliest. We know that in 1 Corinthians 15, he's got that little creed there about Jesus's resurrection, that creedal statement that Paul probably heard about prior to 55 AD. He probably heard it um, back right, very clear, very close to after Jesus was crucified, because Paul came to faith between 30 and 40 AD, and he wrote his letters after that. So Paul received all the information about what he wrote in his letters prior to when he wrote them. So he probably was getting the information from 30 to 40 AD, somewhere in that range, right? Very close to after Jesus was crucified. And that's the creed I was talking about, 1 Corinthians 15. That letter right there is 55 AD, but that information Paul gets there, he receives that information earlier date. So that means that pushes back one of the earliest records about Jesus's resurrection to probably 30 to 40 AD, somewhere in that range. So very, very early on, the gospel is being proclaimed and the resurrection is being proclaimed very early on. Paul's other letters, like Romans, Romans dated 55 to 56. He talks about Jesus's relationship to David. He's in the line of David. David's a real historical person. So that's a very early record. Also, he mentions his resurrection there. First Thessalonians, there's a couple passages about Jesus's death and resurrection. First Thessalonians is dated about 50 AD, so they're proclaiming Jesus' death and resurrection very early on as well. There's some other records or some other letters that support that. It's being taught, proclaimed, passed on. Jesus' death and resurrection. Not hard to memorize that either, by the way, if you're passing that on orally. And some people say, sometimes people object. They say, well, Paul never wrote much about the earthly Jesus. I mean, he never really said much about Jesus's earthly life, and that's just simply not true. He says a lot of things about Jesus's earthly life. He talks about Jesus's Jewish ancestry. He talks about his relationship to David, how he's in the line of David. He talks about Jesus being born of a woman, being born under the law. He talks about Jesus's brothers, Jesus's disciples, James. Talks about Jesus being poor, Jesus's humility, Jesus's meekness and gentleness, his abuse by others. Paul confirms a lot of the same teachings on Jesus on divorce and remarriage, some other things. So there are a lot of historical things Paul says about Jesus's earthly life. So that's just not true at all. Of course, he talks about talks about the duty to love neighbors, love your neighbors yourself, bear the burdens of others. Talks about Jesus' death, of course, talks about the resurrection appearances. So there are little details of Paul's letters about Jesus' earthly life. I don't know why sometimes people think that unless Paul met Jesus directly, that he can't tell us anything about Jesus that's worthwhile. That's stupid, in my opinion. I think that's a silly objection. When I say stupid, I just think it's silly. That's what I mean. I'm not saying the person's stupid who says that. I just think it's a silly objection or stupid objection. And that's because I think if you look at the primary and secondary sources, like I said, Paul's a mix of both. So, and you don't just dismiss everything in writing just because the person who wrote about that person didn't meet them directly, right? You have all kinds of books on your shelf, I would assume, if you have any books by people that write about others that didn't know them directly. I mean, that you'd have to get rid of a lot of biographies, right? So that's not Paul. Paul clearly knew everything about the early Jesus movement. Maybe he did meet Jesus prior to when he persecuted the believers. We don't know. He certainly doesn't say anywhere, but we know that he knew all about the early movement, the early Christian movement. There is a little difference. Sometimes people object to Paul and say that maybe his conversion, like his Damascus Road experience, is similar to Muhammad or Joseph Smith. Muhammad and Joseph Smith both had revelatory experiences, at least they thought were revelatory. I would say they're all man-made. They're not really any revelation from any God, because I don't think there's good evidence for the Book of Mormon. I don't think there's any evidence for the Book of Mormon, and the Quran has all kinds of problems as well. But the point is, people try to compare Paul with Muhammad and Joseph Smith, because Paul had this individual revelation on Damascus Road. Muhammad was by himself, and Joseph Smith was by himself. So maybe they're all kind of the same thing. But Paul's different because all his resurrection experience was corroborated by the other apostles. They all had resurrection experiences, or what they thought they saw was a risen Jesus. So Paul wasn't like the only one. If he'd been the only one, it'd be different, but he was not the only one. He was one of several, right? And we know that a lot of the witnesses left the Mormon church or excommunicated early on in Mormonism. Okay. And there's no archaeological evidence in the Book of Mormon. Okay, let's look at the oral tradition. Remember, I was going down the power thing, Power. Obviously, the information about Jesus was passed on orally to begin with. It wasn't written down right away, it was passed on orally. So someone may say, well, how can the witnesses in the New Testament remember and record the information accurately? We know that Jesus was seen as a rabbi. I mean, he wasn't formally trained like some of the rabbis but we know he taught with great authority and certainly taught a lot of things quoted the Old Testament a lot. We know that he repeated things over and over. We know that many Jewish people in that day had to memorize large portions of the Old Testament. So memorizing things was not uncommon in that day. The problem is we live in such a text-based culture today that a lot of people have a hard time believing they can memorize things. But we know that many Jews were educated. They had schools at that time. Synagogue, of course, they had the synagogue, home, and elementary school. There were schools you could go to, and they had to memorize a lot of information, and they learned under rabbis, and they had to follow the rabbi, learn from the rabbi, then eventually emulate the rabbi. So oral memorization was common in that day. It wasn't that hard to do. And we know that, as Robert Stein pointed out a long time ago in his book, The Method of Jesus' Teachings, that a lot of the ways Jesus taught would make things easy to memorize. He had a certain teaching style that was common in a Jewish culture that allowed the disciples to memorize things. Okay, so it wasn't like Jesus was doing weird things or like making it hard on them to memorize things. He says things that, he also stresses the need to remember and memorize things in certain passages. Like in Matthew 7:24, he says, everyone then who hears these words of mine acts on them will be like a wise man who built his house on the rock. There's other passages he talks about, the importance of what he's saying. And then, of course, we know the Holy Spirit came after Jesus was resurrected. And the Holy Spirit helped them to recall things that Jesus said. They had supernatural help. So that's another thing we need to remember. Now, some people have always objected that perhaps the story of Jesus is like a telephone game. I used to play telephone game when I was a little kid. I used to get invited over to birthday parties. And I remember going up my friend's attic in his third floor of his house, and sat around a circle and did telephone. So some people think if you haven't played telephone, that's where one person whispers something in one person's ear, and then you try to remember it, and then you pass it on, right? And then you get to the very last person, and you try to see if it's been accurately transmitted. And there's a very good chance by the very last person that circle it has not been transmitted correctly. Something's been lost, right? Because they couldn't remember. Being the children's attention spans are not very good, and mine wasn't. I think I probably forgot some of it, and I didn't pass it on correctly. My friends didn't pass it on correctly. So some people think that maybe is what the Jesus story is like. Like one person heard it, whispered it in somebody's ear, and then it just went around a circle and eventually got all messed up, and it never got corrected. And at the end, we just got a big garbled message that isn't correct. And that is totally ridiculous. That is not how you want to read the Jesus story. This is 2025, and people have been playing telephone game for a while, I know, but this is not the first century. not the same time period. So that's really an anachronistic way of reading the New Testament, assuming the telephone game is the way the Jesus story was passed on. That's what we call a chronological problem. Assuming the 21st century way of doing things is the way Jesus and the disciples did that. First of all, you have Jesus talking, which he has a lot of authority and a lot of weight and a lot of care as far as like people listening to him would probably take him a little more seriously than a children's game of telephone. When he says something, I would say there's a very good chance his disciples are taking it seriously and remembering what he said, not just like a sloppy telephone game. He also, as I said, he repeated it over and over. He used teaching techniques where they could remember things. And you have also multiple communities memorizing what Jesus is saying. And then you also have supervision. You don't have like in telephone game, there's not really someone supervising it generally. And a lot with the apostles, you certainly have supervision over the message and they can correct it if it is being passed on incorrectly, but that's an if, but I don't even know if it was needed to be corrected. The point is there's apostolic oversight. And then you have the disciples or the apostles going out and preaching what they heard, right? What they memorized and heard, and they're dying for it. So if it was just a sloppy telephone game, I mean, the way Jesus's teachings was passed like a sloppy telephone game, that would be awfully hard to go out and then preach something that was so misunderstood and so garbled that to think that they would go out and preach that. I think they probably had a little more on the line to get it right. Okay, a lot more was on the line to get the story correct. Okay. All right. Now, when it comes to the W, as far as written tradition, we know that we find out a lot about Jesus in the four Gospels and in the book of Acts. Of course, there's other letters in the New Testament too. Most scholars, if you look at what we call conservative scholars and then liberal scholars a little more biased against the supernatural. Conservative dating for people that are open to miracles and think the miracles happen obviously date the Gospels a little earlier. Like I said, liberal scholars date them later. That's the way it's always going to be. But remember, as I said before, Paul's letters are earlier than the Gospels. So it's always earlier. Paul's information about Jesus is earlier. So some people say, we don't really know maybe for sure who wrote the Gospels. And what they say, a lot of times, if you take a New Testament class at a secular university or you go online, some people say the Gospels were written anonymously. And that's because they say, well, the authors of the Gospels don't put their names on them. It doesn't say, I, Luke, write this Gospel, or I, Matthew, wrote this, or I, Mark, write this. Of course, John says at the end of John, there's enough information, talks about, John's an eyewitness, but they don't write on them like written by Matthew, Mark. They don't say that like I wrote this. And that's a ridiculous requirement that people have of the Gospels, because that's just not the kind of literature they are. Because if you ever read Plutarch, who's a contemporary of Jesus, if you've ever looked at any of his biographies, he's got 60 biographies he wrote. We can acquire about 50 of them today. His name is not on any of the biographies, none of them. Yet nobody questions whether Plutarch wrote them, because most authors at the time of that time period in history didn't really put their names in the biographies. So it's a different time. Not a big deal as far as the way they write. It's not a big deal not to put your name on the biography. But all the ancient manuscript evidence we have from 2nd century on, the manuscripts we find all have the gospel authors' names on them. All we find is Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So we don't really I mean, it's very hard to say, to assume that the Gospels were written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John when all we have is manuscript evidence. That's one of the few things we do have, and all the manuscripts show their names on them, even though they're starting the second century. So that's a challenge as well. Now, there's no doubt that the Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are a form of testimony, meaning that this is they're telling their testimony about what happened. Of course, that's the way it is with a lot of history, right? You're reading someone's testimony. That's a lot what this guy talked about in his book, The Gospels and Eyewitness Testimony, or Jesus and the Eyewitnesses by Richard Bauckham. So that's what he was talking a lot about in this book, about a lot of things we can only know in history is through the trust of testimony. You know, are they telling the truth? You're hearing their testimony. Just like we study the Holocaust witnesses, are they telling the truth? Or 9/11 witnesses by now, 9/11, do the math when 9/11 was in 2001. We have witnesses that are there. Of course, we have video camera and everything, but the point is that a lot of times in history, we have to listen to the testimony of the witnesses. And when you look up that word eyewitnesses, it really is where we get the word autopsy from. And there's what we call direct autopsy and indirect autopsy. So we talk about like direct autopsy, that's like direct eyewitnesses. Those are those that would consist of those that participated in the events. That would be someone like Matthew and John. Okay. And then what we call indirect autopsy is someone that wasn't a direct eyewitness, but they get their information from a direct eyewitness. They didn't, like Luke is not a direct eyewitness. He gets his information from others, and Mark gets most of information from Peter. So it's like when he says there in Luke 1:4, he says, since many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the events, they've been fulfilled among us, just as those are eyewitnesses from the beginning, ministers of the word, have handed them down to us. I did too decide after investigating everything carefully anew to write it down orally sequence for you, most excellent Theophilus, and you realize the certainty of teachings you receive. So notice he says very clearly he's getting this information from the other eyewitnesses. Nothing wrong with that. I mean, Luke basically, if you read Luke's gospel, obviously he gets a lot of things right. He records a lot of historical things that are confirmed by archaeology. He confirms 32 cities or 32 countries, 44 cities and 9 islands without air. So Luke is a first-rate historian as far as recording history. Mark, like I said, Mark gets a lot of information from Peter. He's listening to Peter's testimony, and Peter is Mark's primary eyewitness. So he names Peter 7 times, or I'm sorry, he names Simon with reference to Peter 7 times and Peter 19 times. So it's pretty well established that Mark is using Peter as his eyewitness, right? Mark's not a direct eyewitness, but he's using Peter's eyewitness testimony. A lot of that is confirmed through a lot of the church fathers and others that Mark is using Peter. Papias, others talk about this. And then when it comes to Matthew would be considered a direct eyewitness, most likely. He does seem to know a lot about the geography. He knows a lot about money. Obviously, he's a tax collector. Knows a lot about the Old Testament. But you can see how much in the book of Matthew talks about money. It has more references to money than any other gospel. So most likely, Matthew's background as a tax collector helped him write that gospel. And then John, let me skip to John. I'm sorry. I want to mention John. Yeah, John was most likely an eyewitness because, once again, he's talks about so much of the Israeli geography and customs. And there's a great book called Historical Reliability of John's Gospel. If you ever get this, by Craig Blomberg, he calls it. So there's 59 historically confirmed or historically eyewitness details in the book of John. Now, remember that there's a few ways of looking at this. Like my friend James Warner Wallace wrote in his book Cold Case Christianity. You could talk about firsthand experience eyewitnesses. Those are witnesses that describe events and occurrences they personally observed and experienced. Those are similar, like I said, about Matthew and John. And then there's firsthand access eyewitnesses, which are probably like Luke and Mark. Like I said, they didn't personally observe them, but they're aware on the basis of the information they got from their sources, such as Luke getting that from his sources and Mark getting that from Peter. And then there's firsthand knowledge eyewitnesses, which include a lot of the general cultural conditions. Now, John does that a lot too, and Matthew does that. Now, if you ever want to know anything about Jesus outside the New Testament, some people will say, well, do we have anything written about Jesus outside the New Testament? I mean, the New Testament's written by people who are his followers, and they're all biased. So some people will say. There is information about Jesus outside the New Testament. It's not a ton of information, but there's some stuff there. Jesus was not really that special, believe it or not. He wasn't. You're not going to have a ton of things written about him from Roman sources because the Romans considered the Jews superstitious, and they're really not that interested in Jesus. You're not going to have a lot of information written about him, period, because writing wasn't something that was as abundant then, just people writing things down. I mean, it's just a different day, right? But there is some information about Jesus outside the New Testament. The consensus are some of these things here, some of them. One of the best books you can get on that is Jesus Outside the New Testament, Introduction to Ancient Evidence by Robert Van Voorst. But, it's generally the consensus from the sources outside the New Testament. Jesus was a real person. He was considered some kind of miracle worker. He was crucified under Pilate. There's some small evidence in Josephus that his disciples believe he rose from the dead. Now, Josephus does not believe in Jesus is the Messiah. There's some evidence that the disciples worshipped him. I think that's in Pliny the Younger. And then the movement spread rapidly, and his followers renounced material goods, and they thought they believed they were immortal in the extent that they would live forever because of the resurrection. But if someone ever says to you, well, the gospel authors are biased, I've had people say that to me, like, do you have anything written about Jesus outside the New Testament? Because the New Testament authors are all biased, and that's written by his followers. Well, I always say to them, someone brings this up, I always ask them, well, tell me, what do you mean by bias? Does that mean they're committed to telling the truth? Does that mean they're lying? Are they fabricating things? And, and I try to get them to really pinpoint why that's such a bad thing to be biased. Because, everybody has some bias. Bias can just mean that you're interested in getting to the truth. So I always ask them what they mean by bias. Are the Holocaust survivors biased when they wrote about the Holocaust? I mean, yeah, they were there. I mean, they want to tell the truth. They're passionate about telling the truth, and they want to get the story right. But if they do want that information outside the New Testament, I can give some of that to them, like I just showed you. But overall, the New Testament documents are the best place to start for Jesus. As I say, being biased about something does not mean you cannot tell the truth. In many cases, bias means someone is more inclined to get the story right. And if they are lying, can you please show me where they're lying? That's what I ask them. Remember, the Gospels, what they are, they're a form of biography, by the way. And they record mostly, the authors record the life of Jesus. They condense it in what they want you to know. They don't think Jesus' childhood is that important. That's why they don't include a lot of information about Jesus' childhood. Just a little bit in Luke's gospel. But there's not a lot there about Jesus' upbringing. That's just not the main bulk of what they find important about the life of Jesus. So as biographers, they put stuff in, leave stuff out about Jesus's life. They include in there the most important aspects of his life, which is mostly, if you noticed, probably some of his teachings, his miracles, and of course his death and resurrection, right? So, um, oh, so the E in the power is what we call early manuscript evidence, and we know that we have a lot of Greek New Testament manuscripts for Jesus. I mean, for the New Testament. As far as we know, there's over 5,700 Greek partial and complete manuscripts. Not all those are complete manuscripts, but the more manuscripts, the better. It helps them reconstruct, um, gives them more to work with if they have to try to match them up with each other. The more, the better. Um, we know that the New Testament has more manuscripts than anything else in antiquity. Um, like I said, about 5,700 compared to some of these others hardly have any. So that gives us more gives textual scholars more information they can work with to reconstruct, to compare them and reconstruct what happened if they have to do that. Um, because we have so many manuscripts, as I said before, you should expect some differences, some small differences in the manuscripts. That's why the more you have, the better, because you can compare them. If you have something that's, um, if you look at four different manuscripts, then you see something like a word's missing or a spelling error or something, you can look at the other manuscripts and compare them and reconstruct it. So that's why, as I said, the more manuscripts, the better. Sometimes, of course, that happens with the New Testament. They're going to find things where there's a scribal, something's, there's the editorial, probably like there's a word missing or a spelling error or something, and that allows them to reconstruct those. That's why we need more manuscripts. The more, the better. Um, so sometimes when you look at the manuscripts, as I said before, and you say one manuscript says one thing, another manuscript says something different, they end up being called textual variants. And then the places in the text for variants appear called variant units. And what that leads to is people like this guy, who makes his living comparing the manuscripts and the variant readings. You can go to his website, just type in Study of New Testament Manuscripts, Dan Wallace, Center for Study of New Testament Manuscripts. I think that's what it's called. But there's everything on that website you could find out about New Testament manuscripts. But Dan Wallace, who has been one of the top textual scholars in the world, he said, yeah, you have some differences between the manuscripts, but nothing that impacts any major doctrine. Nothing that changes any major doctrine of Christianity. Bart Ehrman, the guy I mentioned before, he's another textual scholar, just saying the same line of Dan Wallace, except he's more atheistic. But he's done a lot of textual research on the New Testament. But he still thinks that the original text of the New Testament can be established when they look at the textual variants. They look at all the manuscripts. He says here, barring extraordinary new discoveries or phenomenal alterations of method, is virtually inconceivable the character of our printed Greek New Testaments ever changed significantly. And he agrees that textual criticism has mostly established the original text of the New Testament. Now, if you compare this to the Quran, just want to mention something, since I deal with Muslims and they think the Quran has never been changed. You start out with the claim of the Quran is that Allah comes to Muhammad. Muhammad's in a cave somewhere and he's seeking, just kind of lost spiritually, but alone and seeking something. But supposedly he has this vision from the angel Gabriel. Allah gives this supernatural revelation through the angel Gabriel to Muhammad. And then Muhammad recites it. He it takes him a certain amount of time. There's a lot of different things that happen, but he ends up reciting what he thinks the angel Gabriel told him orally or supernaturally. And then that becomes eventually the Quran, which we have today. So I'm just going to give you these 6 stages of the Quran just real quick. So you have what's called stage one, where the angel Gabriel revealed the Quran to Muhammad, and Muhammad checked the revelations um, every year from 610 to 600 twice in the last year of his life. I'm sorry, the angel Gabriel revealed the Quran to Muhammad, checked the revelations every year from 610 to 631. Then Muhammad in stage two recites these revelations to his wife. He's confused, thinks a demon is choking him at one point. And then he starts to recite these revelations to other followers, including some of his later wives as well. Then in stage three, after Muhammad's death, a guy named Abu Bakr, who was a caliph, he wanted a complete written collection of the revelations. And so then you have all these texts collected within 2 years of Muhammad's death. And then that collection was given to another caliph. And then this collection was given to Umar's daughter Hafsa, one of Muhammad's widows. And then in stage five, a guy named Uthman, who was another caliph, Uthman, he ordered all the various collections to be made into a final version of the Quran, and then he ordered any other version of the Quran to be destroyed. And then it goes on. There's a debate between a couple other Muslim leaders about about the codex, the Quran, because it says supposedly there's some differences, and so there's a lot going on with the formation of the Quran, which we have today. There's a lot. It's not just like, unfortunately, many Muslims, if you talk to them, they think like Allah just dictated it to Gabriel, then he dictated to Muhammad, and then it goes right into our lap today. And the Quran you open in your lap, if you go get a Quran at the store, is the same Quran, the exact same Quran that was passed on supernaturally from Allah to Gabriel to Muhammad to us. They don't seem to understand that there's been changes, and there was a debate over which Quran, and some of the Qurans were burned. So there's a lot going on with the transmission of the Quran, no doubt about it. Remember, even if you have a ton of manuscripts, like we have a lot of manuscripts for the New Testament, that doesn't mean what's in the manuscripts is true. Okay? That's why you need other tests for historicity. For example, like if you have someone that came to you, a Mormon came to your door and witnessed to you at your door, knocked on your door tomorrow and said, well, we have over 50,000 early manuscripts for the Book of Mormon. We have these early manuscripts, Obviously, I mean, that's fine and dandy if you have 50,000 early manuscripts, but that doesn't mean what's in the Book of Mormon is actually true, because the Book of Mormon is fiction. So the same goes with any book. I mean, just because you have a lot of manuscripts isn't the only test for historicity, right? You have to look at other tests, like I've done before on these calls. So I don't like it when people that argue apologetically for the New Testament only use a manuscript argument. I think that's weak. I think you need to include all the tests for historicity. That's one, but you can't use that as the only one. Okay, I don't care if you have 100,000 early manuscripts for the Quran. That doesn't mean what's in the Quran is actually true. Okay. Um, D.A. Carson once said, he's a New Testament scholar. He once said of the 22,000 lines in the New Testament, only 40 are contested, about 400 words, the rest just given over 99.5 transmission accuracy, none affect any significant doctrines. So if you ever hear someone say the Bible's been translated or copied so many times, sometimes you may want to walk them through what they mean by that. I talked about that more on the transmission call I had, um, translation and transmission call I had about 5 months ago. Anyway, okay, and then eventually the R is, our canon. This is what we get, and these are the books that were canonized in the New Testament. I've done other teachings on canon, but we have, this is what we received. We received the text God gave to us. So, someone says, well, the Bible, I can't trust it because, it's been written in different languages and things get lost in language. I've heard that. Well, it's written in English and English is translated from Greek and Hebrew. And so things get lost in language. Well, I just tell people then go learn Hebrew and Greek. If you think everything's lost, go read it because there's plenty of Hebrew and Greek scholars that have translated the Bible and they can show you, what in our English translations, what's if anything's been lost and what's accurate, not accurate. So if you think it just can't be figured out, that's just simply not true at all. People have been doing it for many, many centuries now. So that's about all I have. And we will stop there. So hopefully you can use that acronym when you're thinking about how to talk about Jesus. Just think of the word power and think about Paul, oral tradition, written tradition, early manuscript evidence, and reception. Most people don't know Paul's letter is the earliest we have. I can tell you, not one person I've ever taught to on a college campus knows that. Nobody. Okay. I can tell you that the average person in the culture will say, Gospels are written way, way later on, way, way later on. We can't trust them. They're legendary. They don't know Paul's letters are written way before that. And they don't know Paul can tell us anything about Jesus. I've used 1 Corinthians 15 with people many times. They don't know anything about 1 Corinthians 15. If you just open that up and say, this is one of the earliest records we have about Jesus' death and resurrection, they don't know anything about that. I'm not trying to be snarky. I'm just saying reality, most people don't know that. Okay. So that is about it.